Alright, we are moving on in physics, looking at chapter 2, sections 3 and 4. These are fairly straightforward and they are mostly focused on kind of stuff that you've seen in Algebra 1 and just kind of introducing them. There's not going to be too much new physics material in this. Okay, so the first thing is our variables. So with our variables, we've got two different types of variables. We have our independent variable and our dependent variable. The independent variable, which is usually your x variable, it's going horizontally along the x-axis. This is your it's sometimes called the manipulated variable. It is what manipulates the equation. So as time moves on, time is increasing, it's something that is not being affected by anything. The length of something, um, the height in which you're dropping something, those are independent because they are the ones that are affecting the equation, and they are changing your dependent variable, but they are by themselves. There's nothing really affecting them. Your dependent variable, which is also your responding variable, is usually your y variable, so it's the one going up and down. So if, let's say I'm taking something and I'm dropping it off a roof, or at different heights, the heights would be your independent variable because it's, if I drop it at 6 feet, if I drop it at 8 feet, if I drop it at 12 feet, if I drop it at 18 feet, those are your independent variables because those are kind of set. There's not really changing. Your dependent variable would be the amount of time that it takes for it to fall, the amount of force that's generated, the speed or velocity that's generated. Okay, so all that stuff would end up being your dependent variable because they are responding to the height that's being dropped. Okay, so that's your x and your y um, variables. Okay, all right. So linear equation, again, looking at a lot of stuff that you probably saw early on in math. So linear equation set up usually as y equals mx plus b. M is your slope, b is your y-intercept. So the b is the original value, how much you had when x was 0. Okay, so that's your linear equation. Those are linear growths. It's a constant growth. So if it goes up by 3 every time, so it goes 3, 6, 9, 12, so on. 5, 8, 11, 14, yada, yada, yada. If it grows consistently at a constant rate, that would be your linear. Okay. Next up is our quadratic. So quadratic is where you have your parabolas. That's y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. We're just kind of looking at it as y equals x, or k, x squared. And k is your growth constant, so the higher that number is, the larger it is, the faster it grows. So if the k value is 7, that's going to grow faster than a k value of 6. If that k value is negative, that means you're decreasing, so that means it's falling. Okay, so it would be a parabola opening downward. Next up is our inverse. So our inverse are ones that as the x increases, the y decreases at some sort of rate. And so that rate in which it does is using the formulas either xy is equal to k or y equals k over x. So with your inverse, when you take your x and y values and you multiply them together, they should always equal the same number. That would be an inverse. Yeah. Alright, so that was the end of section 3. Section 4, again, it's kind of going through both these fairly quickly. Section 4 is dealing with manipulating equations. So, manipulating equations is basically taking an equation and solving for one of the variables. So taking a formula. In this case, if we have all 4 of these, let's say we wanted to solve for v in any of these. So if we look at the very first one, d equals vt, if we have d equals vt, and we want to solve for v, you're just going to use your basic algebra skills. How do you get v by itself? Well, since it's being multiplied by t, we have to divide both sides by t. And so your equation ends up being t, or v, is equal to d over t. Okay. So take a second and find v for these, manipulating the equations. Alright, so the one on the bottom, t equals d over v, your answer would end up being v equals d over t again. You'd multiply both sides by v and then divide by t. The top one on the right hand side, a equals v squared over d2d. First thing you'd want to do is multiply both sides by 2d, and then you would end up taking the square root. That's how you get rid of the squared. So it ends up being the square root of 2ad is equal to v. And the last one is just a proportion. So, cross multiply divide, and you end up with v equals ab over c. Alright, so now units and equations. So if we have something like v equals, so we're saying that v, or velocity, is equal to 11.0 meters per second, and time is equal to 6.00 seconds, and we want to find d equals vt. So we want to find the distance that's found. What we would do is that we'd end up just plugging in these numbers. So v is 11.0 meters per second, t is 6.00 seconds, and when we multiply them, you multiply the numbers together. So when you multiply the numbers together, 11 times 6, essentially, would end up being 66. So it'd be 66.0. And then we have meters over seconds times seconds over 1. And then we'd want to reduce those units. Okay, so that's going to be one thing with this as we move through, is that these units, sometimes they'll be reducing, sometimes they won't be. We have different names for certain types of groups of units, joules and stuff like that. So if we have m over s times s, we end up getting those s's disappeared. They eliminate each other, leaving us with just m. So we end up with 66.0 meters, which makes sense because d is distance. Okay. All right, that's the end of this section, these two. Yeah, we're going to be continuing on, moving on to the next one is dealing with velocity, speed, velocity, displacement, and all that fun stuff.